Welcome to this week's Points to Ponder. These Points to Ponder videos are sponsored by St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I serve as a vicar, which is like a pastor. At St. Luke's during October, we have a special time of celebration because during October there's the feast of our patron saint, St. Luke, which occurs on October 18th. And usually we'd have a big homecoming weekend that weekend. But with COVID-19 and sheltering in and not doing in-person worship, we came up with another idea. We're devoting this entire month of October to celebrating the values that St. Luke's has held since its founding in 1936. We're known, and our motto is that we are historically Black, radically inclusive, and we try to walk with Jesus. To walk with Jesus especially into situations that need healing and grace, especially situations that involve injustices, where justice needs to be done. So in each week of October, these Points to Ponder will focus on one aspect of justice, which brings us to today's point to ponder. It's a point about environmental justice. And the point comes from the 24th Psalm, a part of verse 1, which says, "The earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it." My guest today is my good friend, the Reverend Paul McCloud. Paul is the Minister of Education at Calvary Baptist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. Welcome, Paul. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Certainly, Pastor. Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Paul McCloud. I'm from here in Knoxville, Tennessee. Both my wife and I are from Knoxville, Tennessee. We've got a son and a daughter. One lives on the East Coast, one lives on the West Coast. And I've been here at Mount Calvary Baptist Church as a minister of education for about 5 years now.
Excellent. And say a little bit about KIKMA also, because I know that's an important part of your life.
Yeah, the KIKMA stands for the Knoxville Interdenominational Christian Ministerial Association. We're basically a group of clergy, pastors and non-pastors, basically preachers who want to come together to fellowship, to promote Christianity here in the Knoxville metropolitan area. And we really just want to enhance the spiritual and the economic well-being of the Knoxville metropolitan area. And that's what we do. We have meetings every Tuesday at 10:30 now by Zoom. We used to meet in person, of course, but now we meet by Zoom.
And what Paul didn't say is that he is the vice president of that organization and doing a wonderful job with that. So our point today, for this Points to Ponder, is a point about environmental justice. And that point is taken from Psalm 24, from the first part of the first verse of that psalm. I quote, "The earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it." And I hear you have a story related to that point.
Yeah, when I think about environmental justice, I think about my father. He was the Fair Housing Director for the state of Tennessee for the Housing Urban Development back in the 70s. If you remember back in the 70s, there was desegregation of neighborhoods going on. Here in Tennessee, there was desegregation of the schools. And my father's job was to go to the big cities in Tennessee and basically tell them to stop redlining and to break open some of the neighborhoods that traditionally were not, that blacks and people of color were not able to get into. As a part of his job also, he looked at land use management. And the interesting thing is that even back in the 70s, they noticed that blacks and people of color usually were in the neighborhoods that didn't have good land. They were by the railroad tracks or the factory, or they were near some Superfund site that was contaminated. And so he worked on that end also, and then making sure that along with redlining, that blacks and people of color had access to some of the better neighborhoods. And then he worked also with legislators on, they didn't call it environmental justice back then. They just wanted to make sure that access to all neighborhoods was available to everyone. And a component of that was the impact of the environment on certain neighborhoods. And so that's what I kind of think of when I think about environmental justice and some of the things my father worked with.
One of the reasons that the point came to me from the Psalm, the idea that the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, is because the Christian faith and in some ways even other communities of faith have not always had a good record about honoring the environment and realizing that the environment, our earth, our water, that everything in it, including the people, all people, are here as gifts. And I wonder if you could comment just on that idea that the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, and how that relates to economic justice for you.
Yeah, when I think about this area, I think of that we probably need to stay away from two extremes. One extreme as Christians is that we say, well, the earth is going to be renewed one day, and God told us to fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over it, so we can treat the earth any way we want to. And there's a general apathy about the stewardship of what we're using. The other end of the spectrum, the other extreme, is to worship the earth instead of God. Worshiping the created instead of the creator. That we hold the earth up in such high esteem that we don't give God the credit and the glory for creating the earth. And so those are kind of two extremes that I've seen within maybe some churches or within the church in general that we need to stay away from. But I think the key thing is where we start. We were made in the image of God, so that we have inherent dignity, and the earth belongs to God. There's an ownership there, that he actually owns it, but he's given us the privilege and the responsibility to take care of it. The term we always use a lot of times in churches is we are stewards of someone else's property. And if we keep that in mind, then I think there's a due amount of care. Some people, I've heard the phrase creation care. There's a certain amount of creation care that we should have because we're respecting someone else's property. So that's what I think about, and that's kind of the starting point when we talk about economic justice.
So say a little more about how we care for creation. What are the kinds of things we need to be aware of and pay attention to?
Yeah, there's probably a couple different aspects of it. On the proactive side of it, things like not polluting, things like not littering. I mean, those are even things that we do individually. But from more of a societal or even a systemic view, things in place to take care of the earth, like not raping the land to get all the resources out, and not leaving the land contaminated for people to live on. So those were kind of like proactive things that we can do. Good land use management in any type of city, whether it be a city really or rural areas. Those are some of the proactive things that we can do. What I would call maybe kind of reactive things that we can do is we know that in this fallen world, we know that there's already some things that are not right. Unfortunately, if you look at just about any city, there are pockets of places where Black people and people of color seem to be situated that are, like I said earlier, near the factory. And traditionally have been the cheaper land, but they may be contaminated. And then living conditions, for example, lead paint in houses or mold in schools and things like that. So keeping our eyes open to things like that. If you go into your son or your daughter's school and you see mold, then we need to challenge the system. We need to go to that school board and to say and to advocate for our children in that particular example. We need to stand up and say, hey, this is affecting, and a lot of times, unfortunately, with minority neighborhoods, especially in the cities, they are disproportionately affected by a lot of the environmental things. Like I said, the lead-based paint, contaminated water, contaminated land, or contaminated air. Those types of things disproportionately affect certain neighborhoods in just about any city. So when we talk about environmental justice, it's not only doing the individual things that we should do, don't litter, those types of things, but really standing up and being the voice and being the advocate for those that are weaker and that are vulnerable, and standing up and saying, hey, look, this environmental situation is not right. Let's pass a law, or let's go to court, or let's organize to approach those that are responsible, whether it be a board or a mayor or a governor or things like that, to be the voice for the vulnerable or for the weak. And so that's the work that we really have to do when we talk about environmental justice.
We started with a story about your getting some sense of environmental justice from the work your father did. I wonder if there's a story that has happened as you've gone on in life that has raised some of the needs you just talked about to a level of more awareness for you. Is there any story you connect to that? Yes. I was in the Army for about 5 or 6 years, and I was in the Army in field artillery, and I was an officer. And for a few years, I got to do some crazy stuff like jump out of planes for a living, and go through swamps in the middle of the night, all that kind of stuff. And so I was with the Ranger Battalion, and for several years, every year, we went to Vieques Island in Puerto Rico. It's on southeast of the main island of Puerto Rico, island called Vieques. And we did live fire training there. And we shot mortars, we had live fire with rifles, brought in close air support jets, had naval gunfire, we had simulated war basically on this island. Well, it wasn't until the second year of me going down there to realize that was a contaminated area. And every year it was contaminating more and more area. And I didn't know about the local impact it was having on the people there until about the second year, and we got to know some people there, and we found out that it had negative effects on the local population economically and also health-wise. There was a high percentage of lead in their water system because of that contaminated area, all those rounds coming in and depleted chemicals and things like that. So that's when I kind of opened my eyes up and I saw how it was affecting the local population.
Well, fast forward years and years later, I was no longer in that unit. I had gotten out of the Army. And I don't know if you remember, but there was a big thing about Vieques Island. And the Army finally heard the local population and got out of that area and stopped using that and stopped having that type of environmental effect on the local population. So it kind of opened my eyes up. It was fun, doing all those things in the Army and everything. But when I saw the impact that it had on the people, then it really, made me aware of how we can affect the environment.
If you were going to just say one thing to somebody who didn't really get what became such an awareness for you, I don't think people set out to harm things. I think we do it because we're not really aware of the impact a lot of times. What would you say to people today? It's just sort of a closing couple of words about paying attention to environmental justice.
Yeah, I would say definitely as a Christian to understand and be aware that we were all made in the image of God and that we have inherent dignity. So how we treat other people and their living conditions really speak to how much we care about how God has stamped us with his image. And I would say, get outside and look at creation. There's a general revelation. The Bible talks about we know of God because we see him in what he has created. Go to the Smoky Mountains. We have a lot of trails here in Knoxville. Look at creation, see how beautiful creation is, and see what God has created, and see what he has revealed to us in nature. And then compare that to some of the places that we have affected, some of the places that don't have clean water, for example, the Flint, Michigan incident, or they don't have clean air, like children in China, and some of the larger cities in the United States. And compare and contrast that and pray about what God would have you to do to be a voice to those that are vulnerable and weak and not able to stand up and say, hey, well, this really should be better. And that's what I would say.
Paul, thank you so much for spending this time with me today.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it.